That show scared the hell out of me as a kid. So Sony making headlines this week by announcing that they're going to be a no-show at E3 2019. The first time in 24 years that they're not showing up. And it's going to be weird. It's going to be like House of Cards without Frank Underwood. I just don't think it's going to feel right. They're also saying that they're not planning on doing any shows or announcements around the time of E3. So they're not going to show up for, just being on the floor, have a conference off-site like a lot of these other companies do. They're just not showing up, period. Here's their statement. Quote, as the industry evolves, Sony continues to look for inventive opportunities to engage the community by not showing up. PlayStation fans mean the world to us, and we always want to innovate, think differently, and experiment with new ways to delight gamers. As a result, we have decided to not participate in E3 2019. We are exploring new and familiar ways to engage our community in 2019 and can't wait to share our plans with you. Don't you love it when people say they can't wait to do something, yet they end up waiting to do something? So Sony says, we love you, we want to wow you, so we're not going to be there at the biggest video game conference of the year. It's sort of a strange move, but there's no shortage of theories being tossed around as to why and what they're planning. You know that they got something planned because we are nearing the end of the generation. Everybody's looking forward to the next Xbox, the next PlayStation. But in order to understand what they may be doing, you may just have to simply look to the past to understand the future. Think back. If you remember back in 2013, Sony CEO Kaz said, quote, why go first when your competitors can look at your specs and come up with something better? And if you read the article, of course, this was written before anything was announced or officially revealed. That the question they ask is, does that mean that Sony is going to let Microsoft make the first move? And as we all know, they did. Microsoft did go first and made one of the biggest blunders in gaming history with their rollout. And Sony took advantage of every single one of those blunders and won the generation. They basically won the generation, I think, at launch. Not that Sony had everything planned, because if you look back also, Sony actually admitted that they rewrote their E3 script for PlayStation 4 because they saw the backlash Microsoft had received. So the question is this simply falling back on the tactic that worked for them in the past and arguably helped them dominate this generation by letting Microsoft take the stage and go first? It's easier to counterpunch than it is to punch, at least when it comes to business. We all know Microsoft is ready to leave this generation behind, and it's why they were already reminding people last E3 that they were going ahead and working on the next Xbox. So if they're so eager to kickstart this next generation, especially with Phil saying things like they're committed to having the most powerful console from this day forward, what happens if they reveal their specs and Sony then one-ups them and brings something better? So by letting Microsoft make the first move again, it does put a lot of pressure on Microsoft, although I don't think it's bad that Microsoft will have E3 basically to themselves. I'm sure they're very thankful for that, and I think it's going to work out well for them. I think it is giving Microsoft a big leverage, but it also puts a lot of pressure on them because they have to deliver. Like, the world is watching them, and it's going to be exciting to watch. Now, one of the biggest things that is being tossed about is that Sony is skipping E3 because they simply don't have any new games to show. So we know that they still haven't released Last of Us Part 2, Death Stranding, Ghost of Tsushima, Days Gone, and Dreams. So those are all games that have been announced and that we pretty much saw most of those last year at E3. And so I don't think they want to show up again and show off the same games that you showed last year, because you're going to end up disappointing a lot of people. I mean, let's be real. A lot of people were disappointed in Sony's E3 conference last year whenever they did show all those games. I said last year and a lot of people said last year, that Xbox won the show hands down as far as style. Now, one other thing that I mentioned was that I actually thought that Sony had the better games shown as far as exclusives, because if you go back and watch, Xbox was game after game after game, but it was third-party game after game after game for the most part. And so they brought a lot of third-party, Xbox did, and Sony had the better exclusives, but Sony's format was absolutely horrible. They had people walking from like some church to some other stage. It was just stupid. And then there was all this, filter in between, and it was just horrible formatting. And so I think Xbox won the format, but PlayStation had better games. But if you're going to bring the same games, you're not going to bring any new ones. Why show up in the first place? I don't think anybody in their right mind would believe that Sony doesn't have more games that are coming. But I do think they're done announcing new games for PlayStation 4. And I think they're saving up titles to show off on the PlayStation 5. So I think it would be safe to assume it's not that they don't have any new games, but rather they can't show you any new games yet until they reveal their hardware that they want you to be playing these on. The other part of the story could be that Sony wants the spotlight. Now, I know that sounds weird. If you want the spotlight, you show up to be in the spotlight. And, look, there's no doubt that during the week of E3, it's not going to be good for Sony. Everybody's going to be talking about how they didn't show up to the game. But is it really going to hurt them? Look at last year. Again, everybody pretty much agreed that Xbox had one of the best shows that they've put on in years, and that Sony blew it. But what changed? Xbox is still in third place for the year in sales, and PlayStation is still number one. Does it hurt Rockstar when they don't show up with GTA or Red Dead at E3? No, just means that they're not competing with 100 other gaming stories that get lost in the mix. I think the way Rockstar shows off their games and announcements is actually pretty smart, because they dominate the entire news cycles for usually weeks at a time whenever they do drop info. So maybe when Sony does decide to drop their bombs, they want to dominate the cycle in the same way. It's an issue that's been going on with these companies over the last few years, because during this week, look at all the changes that have been recently made. You had EA move their conference off-site. Microsoft moved their conference off-site. Nintendo doesn't even show up to do a traditional conference anymore. They just show pre-recorded videos. And you have all these companies trying to stagger them out at different days, getting ahead more and more, because they know it's so hard to catch a headline that will last more than a few hours during that week. And they may also see the backlash of recent poor conferences and what that has caused. Look at Blizzard and the Diablo fiasco. Look at the Xbox Fan Fest, where the company was promoting it almost as big as E3, and it was more like a flop fest. Whenever you watched it, you had unauthentic crowds jumping up and down chanting Sea of Thieves. So that didn't go over well either. Not even with, I've seen really hardcore Xbox fans who even said that they were really disappointed with this year's show. So in some cases, it might be better to just not have a conference rather than to have a mediocre conference. So Sony could sit back, let Microsoft make the first moves and announcements, and when they feel the time is right, launch a big PlayStation event that reveals the new system and the games that are going to be running on it. And do it during a period where they don't have to compete with anybody else for attention, and possibly be able to undercut Microsoft in ways that they've done in the past that they wouldn't be able to do if they were to announce the same week. It worked out for them in the past, and it could work out for them again. Post your thoughts down below. Why do you think Sony didn't show up, or not going to show up, at E3 2019? Do you agree with some of this analysis that it could be that they are just lying in wait, waiting to pounce? I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.